Field spells have had a huge impact on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame throughout the years, either by being generically powerful or by being superbly strong for the respective archetypes. And in this video, we're going to go over some of the best field spells in the game's history, why they're so strong, and the impact they have on the game as a whole. And infecting the number 10 spot is Zombie World, one of the oldest field spells on this list, and the one with the simplest effect. It just so happens that its effects are very strong in the modern era. The first effect turns all monsters on the field and graveyard into zombie-type monsters. This includes all monsters on your opponent's field and in their graveyard as well as your own. The second effect is a floodgate and prevents any monster from being tribute summoned other than zombie monsters. Ever since its release, Zombie World has been a staple in most zombie-oriented strategies. This is because it allows for your cards that only work with zombie monsters to be used on monsters that usually aren't zombie type. Mezuki is a great example. With Mezuki, you can banish it from the graveyard in order to special summon any zombie monster from your graveyard for free, effectively making it a monster reborn for zombies. But while Zombie World is in your field zone, your options are greatly expanded, allowing you to summon back cards you usually wouldn't have access to. Whether it's a good extender like Lumina, a solid interruption like Ghost Ogre, or even a powerful boss monster like Baron de Fleur. All possible because all of these cards become zombie monsters, making the change of their type really valuable to zombie decks. The same is also true of Doom King Baladroch, one of the premier boss monsters for the zombie decks, and Baladroch has two effects, both of which benefit from the presence of Zombie World. The first of which allows you to summon it from your graveyard every standby phase provided there's a face-up card in either player's field zone. And the second allows you to either negate an effect or banish a card from the field or graveyard. This effect triggers whenever a zombie monster that isn't Baladroch activates its effect. On your turn, it's really easy to trigger since most of your deck is comprised of zombies, but it's less likely that your Baladroch is going to have a chance to trigger on your opponent's turn if they're not playing a zombie deck, unless Zombie World is on the field. Since all of your opponent's monsters become zombies, every single effect your opponent activates on field or in graveyard becomes a potential trigger for Baladroch. In essence, Zombie World is a huge boon for zombie decks, and is something that they want on the field at all times. And while usually it would be quite difficult to activate and find Zombie World across the course of your combo, zombie decks also have access to Necroworld Banshee, a zombie monster which allows you to activate Zombie World from your deck at quick effect speed. But as well as in zombie decks, Banshee and Zombie World have seen play in numerous non-zombie strategies. This is because the type alteration effect isn't just a benefit for zombie strategies, it can also act as a floodgate for certain strategies that are based around monster types. For example, a lot of Dragon Link extra deck monsters are based around using dragon monsters you control as materials. In order to go into Spheres, you need to use 2 dragon monsters, and to go into Striker Dragon, you need a level 4 or lower dragon monster as a material. The same is also true of Tri-Brigade monsters, which each have an effective banished beast, winged beast, or beastware monsters in the graveyard to summon a link monster based on the number of monsters banished. But while Zombie World's face up on the field, every monster in the field and in the graveyards becomes a zombie, preventing decks which are reliant on their typing for their plays from being able to be played at all. So when these type-reliant decks are good, other decks that have ways of getting to Zombie World or putting Banshee in the graveyard will often play them in their main or side deck. Branded, for example, doesn't care about the type of monsters used for the fusion summons most of the time, and are capable of sending Necroworld Banshee to the graveyard with Branded Fusion in order to activate Zombie World from their deck. Or decks like Tearlaments, which is capable of milling a huge portion of their deck, may play Banshee in their side as an extra good mill that they can use to deal with certain strategies. But you may be surprised to know that it's not just the first effect of Zombie World that acts as an incredible floodgate. The second one is just as powerful, but a lot more niche. The second effect of Zombie World may appear useless at first because in the modern era, there are very few decks which actively tribute summon monsters. But for decks that do need to tribute summon, Zombie World basically stops them from playing entirely. This is why Zombie World is currently seen play in a ton of side decks. It completely stops Floowandereeze. Without being able to tribute summon their winged beast monsters, Floowandereeze lose access to M-Pen, their main boss monster, Ryza, their removal, and Apex Avian, their negation. Essentially, with Zombie World up, their entire engine is offline, and even their strongest form of removal in Unexplored Winds requires a tribute summon to occur, something they're locked out of while Zombie World is on the field. Technically, Flu can still normal summon out their small birds into Zombie World and lock you under a barrier statue, but all it takes is a single battle phase to deal with that statue, allowing you to play without worry about being interrupted by stronger interactions. Overall, Zombie World is an excellent card for zombie decks, but has proven itself more worthy by being a niche but excellent floodgate against certain strategies. And this floodgate effect, combined with an ease of access with Necroworld Banshee being one of the best searches for a field spell ever, has allowed Zombie World to see competitive play despite its age, and will likely prop up again in future metagames as a tech choice. And funnily enough, it just so happens to counter the strategy that the next card on this list supports. Making its royal entrance at number 9 is Domain of the True Monarchs. This archetypal field spell for the Monarch monsters is a series of monsters based around tribute summoning, and Domain is an excellent piece of support for both the Monarch strategy and other tribute summoning strategies as a whole, with each one of its effects being extremely beneficial. While it's face up on the field on a soft once per turn, you can reduce the level of a monster in your hand with 2800 attack and 1000 defense by 2, which just happens to be the stat line of the Mega Monarch monsters as well as the Underworld and Heavenly Monarchs. This allows you to reduce the level 8 monsters to level 6 in your hand, meaning they only need 1 tribute to be brought on the field rather than 2. And that's not all, because Domain also gives your tribute summon monsters a free 800 attack when they attack an opponent's monster, allowing your 2800 attack monsters to turn into 3600 attack Goliaths, which is enough to beat over Eldritch the Golden Lord, or crash with Super Quantum Mech King Great Magnus. But Domain's strongest effect by far is its first effect, but that's also the effect that comes with the hardest condition. In order for this effect to apply, you need to have no cards in your extra deck, and be the only player to control a tribute summon monster. But if you fulfill these conditions, your opponent cannot special summon any monsters from the extra deck, essentially making Domain a permanent Scythe lock. This is what allowed Monarchs to see Tier 1 competitive success in 2016 with the release of the Monarch Structure deck. This structure gave Monarchs a ton of new tools to compete in a modern format, as well as a cheap way to actually get access to those tools. These tools included Domain. Locking your opponent out of the extra deck was just as good back then as it is today. Even more so actually, as Monarch was able to stop pendulum decks like the dominant Pepe from being able to pendulum summon out of the resources from the extra deck, which made Monarch an effective counter for the strategy until Pepe was emergency banned and fell out of favor. But even after Pepe fell out of favor, Monarch still saw a ton of competitive success, because Domain was just that strong of a card. And locking your opponent out of the extra deck was such a strong floodgate that it was worth it to play a Monarch deck with 0 extra deck at all, since you could rely on the effects of your main deck boss monsters. One of the things that did hold the strategy back was that it was very bricky and inconsistent. This has helped out a lot with Pantheism with the Monarchs, which had 2 effects to make Monarchs a bit more consistent. The first lets you send a Monarch spell trap from your hand to the graveyard to draw 2 cards. And the second allowed you to banish it from the graveyard to reveal 3 Monarch spell traps from your deck and have your opponent choose one of them to add to your hand. Which sounds mediocre at first, since it gives your opponent the choice. But if you needed Domain, for example, you could just reveal 3 copies of Domain in your deck with the effect of Pantheism, so your opponent is forced to let you search it. But even with Pantheism around, Domain lock with Monarchs wasn't the most consistent strategy, and when it was limited in the later 2016 ban list, Monarchs abruptly stopped seeing play, since Domain locking became a lot more trouble than it was worth. While the Monarch strategy did fall out of favor, it was soon replaced by another tribute summon based control deck, the True Dracos. And Domain just so happened to synergize extremely well with the True Draco monsters, allowing you to lock your opponent out of the extra deck while you gain resources from the True Draco monsters, floodgating your opponent out of the game while you drowned in advantage. Currently though, for as powerful as Domain was in 2016, it no longer sees the amount of competitive play it once did. And that's not because the effect is bad. Quite the contrary, as Artifact Scythe has become a popular tool to floodgate your opponent from playing the game, and Scythe only locks your opponent out of the extra deck for a single turn. But it's just not worth it to have 0 cards in your extra deck anymore, since the extra deck has become such an important tool for most decks. Even Monarch and True Draco decks can now use the extra deck as a tool. Extra deck Monarchs was a fairly popular strategy when Pantheism was limited and saw competitive success. Or alternatively, it can be used as a resource for cards like Pot of Extravagance and Pot of Prosperity, which is why Fluent Rees, a deck based around tribute summoning, doesn't use Domain, since they'd rather use their extra deck for the pot cards. Domain may be used again someday, but even for what it is right now, it had a solid impact in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame and is still absolutely a card to be feared when you see it hit the field. Shining brightly at number 8 is Trickstar Light Stage, the archetypal field spell for the Trickstars that happened to see play in countless other decks, but also elevated its archetype to Tier 1 competitive success. Light Stage has 3 effects, each of one has been integral for the card's competitive success. The first effect allows you to add any Trickstar monster from your deck to your hand upon activation, making it a rota for the entire archetype. The second has a soft once per turn that allows you to target a set back row your opponent controls, and that back row can't be activated until the end of the turn, where your opponent must activate the card, or if they can't activate it, they must send it to the graveyard. And the final effect inflicts an extra 200 burn damage to your opponent whenever a Trickstar monster inflicts any kind of damage to an opponent. For Trickstar, every one of these effects is valuable. The extra burn allows you to stack more burn damage on your opponent, so it's a lot easier to reduce your opponent's life points to 0, and its ability to lock back row for the turn gives it a similar utility to Mystical Space Typhoon or Cosmic Cyclone, stopping your opponent from using the back row to interact with your plays. But by far, the strongest part of Light Stage was that it accessed the entire deck. It made Trickstar an incredibly consistent strategy. You see, with Light Stage, you'd usually be adding Trickstar Candina, another searcher for the deck that was capable of searching any Trickstar card in your deck, not just the monsters. This opened up the entire deck to be searched. Not only did you have access to cards like Licorice and Lilybell, but also it allowed you to search Trickstar Reincarnation from your deck, which allowed you even greater control of the game as you could fully handloop your opponent with Reincarnation if it was used in combination with Droll and Lockbird. And for Trickstar, Light Stage was just an insane consistency tool that let you get +2 in card advantage, as well as blanking back row and causing extra burn damage. But for non-Trickstar decks, it was an engine capable of generating a ton of card advantage, all while locking down your opponent's back row, and paired especially well with Sky Striker until the release of Hayate. But it was the release of Korobane alongside Orcus Nightmare that helped to revitalize the Trickstar engine. With the release of Korobane, Light Stage not only represented a +2 in card advantage, it now also represented 2 bodies on board since Korobane could special summon itself from the hand if you either control dope monsters or only Trickstar monsters. This wouldn't have been such a big deal if it wasn't for the release of Orcus Nightmare. You see, Orcus Nightmare was an Orcus monster, which meant that it could be used for the link summon to something like Galatea, and getting on board meant that even outside of the Orcus archetype, you were capable of performing the full Orcus combo. But it was also a Nightmare monster. This meant that Orcus Nightmare could be summoned with the effect of Nightmare Mermaid, a Link 1 which could be summoned out by using any Nightmare monster, including a Link 2 like Nightmare Phoenix or Nightmare Cerberus. This meant that all that was needed in order to perform the full Orcus combo was 2 monsters on board with different names, which Light Stage could do with no effort at all, being one of, if not the best way to go into the Orcus engine. What's even better was that Light Stage was a going second tool against other Orcus strategies. Because Light Stage could lock back row for the turn, you could lock your opponent's set Orcus Crescendo with Light Stage, which means that whenever you activated Light Stage, your opponent was basically forced to negate it, allowing you to deal with one of your opponent's strongest negates in the game with a single card and without committing any other resources to the board. Light Stage was so strong that it was eventually put on the limited list for how much it helped Orcus strategies, and made it so that Trickstar as an engine mostly fell out of favor, at least until the release of Verte Anaconda, where the engine occasionally saw play as a way to access Dragoon or DPE. Light Stage was eventually put back to 3, but only when the cards it enabled, Verte and Nightmare Mermaid, were on the ban list. And in the modern metagame, a 1-card Link 2 isn't really a crazy notion anymore. But for what it is, Light Stage has had an incredible impact on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame and has been integral to several Tier 1 strategies. And sneaking into number 7 is SPYRAL Resort, yet another archetypal field spell that bolstered its particular archetype to metagame contention, being a key piece of what made Spiral a Tier 0 meta threat. Resort has 3 relevant effects. The third effect has seen the least use and is more of a maintenance cost. During the end phase, you have to either shuffle a monster into the graveyard back into the deck, or destroy Resort. The second effect allows you to search for any Spiral monster on a soft once per turn. And the first effect gives every single Spiral card you control, other than Resort, protection from all forms of targeting. Being a soft once per turn searcher is the main appeal of Resort, as it meant that Spiral decks would cycle through multiple copies of Resort for multiple searches over the course of a single turn. This is especially true when paired with Spiral Master Plan, a Spiral card which lets you search out 3 other Spiral cards, a Spiral Mission card with its on-field effect, as well as a Spiral Resort and a Spiral Monster when it's sent from the field to the graveyard. Essentially, Master Plan represented a search of any 2 Spiral monsters, one with her effect and one with Resort, as well as getting a Spiral Mission Spell or Trap card as well. While both of these effects seem absurd, an issue that Spiral had was committing Master Plan to the board. It could definitely be done with cards like Firewall Dragon or Spiral Gear Big Red, but it wasn't consistent. And this lack of consistency meant that Spiral was initially doomed to be stuck at Rogue tier, until the release of Spiral Double Helix. Helix allowed you to add any Spiral monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand, or special summon it to a zone that Helix pointed to. This allowed you to special summon Master Plan from the deck really easily, which gave you access to 3 searches that Master Plan allowed, including the addition of a Spiral Resort, which would basically protect your entire turn from a lot of interaction. This protection, combined with Spiral's new insane consistency, is what made it a Tier 0 strategy, until it was eventually hit on the ban list, which saw Spiral Resort limited as well as a number of the other Spiral archetype tools. But Master Plan was left untouched. And for a while, this was a pretty effective strategy for curbing the strength of Spiral, especially the limited Resort, as it meant that Spiral was far less likely to have its protection from interruption, as it also meant it couldn't be used multiple times per turn. However, in 2020, Magician's Souls was released, which happened to be an insane extender for Spiral. It could send Master Plan from the deck to the graveyard for costs, making her easy to access, and could send 2 spell trap cards from your hand to the graveyard to draw 2 cards. And if you just so happen to send Spiral Mission Rescue, you could use that Rescue's graveyard effect to revive your Master Plan and trigger both of her searches. But that's not all. You see, the Spiral Resort limit really hurt Spiral for a lot of reasons. It being a free search, of course, was excellent, but only having 1 made it a brick, as it meant that if you drew it, Master Plan couldn't trigger her graveyard effect to search out another Spiral monster and Resort from your deck, since you wouldn't have a copy of Resort in your deck to search. But even if you drew Resort, it wasn't the worst thing in the world, because you could put it back in your deck with the use of Nightmare Unicorn, a Link monster which allowed you to discard a card in order to shuffle 1 card in the field back into the deck. Usually, Nightmare Unicorn is used to target an opponent's card to act as a form of removal, but in Spiral, Unicorn could also be used as an engine piece if you drew Resort by targeting your own field spell. This put Resort back into the deck so that it could be searched out with Master Plan later on in the combo. Unfortunately, in the April 2020 ban list, Master Plan was finally banned, which meant that Spiral's strategy really fell out of favor, since its main searcher was gone and most of its arsenal was still limited. Although it does still have Master Plan available in Master Duel and is still very playable there. While Resort may not have been the heart and soul of Spiral, it certainly helped the deck a lot, especially since it was so easily searchable by one of the best cards the deck has available, and the fact that it was a card that you were willing to shuffle back with your own Nightmare Unicorn just so you could search it again is a testament to how strong Resort, Master Plan, and Spiral were as a whole. But as it stands right now, even with Resort available to the deck, it's not going to be destroying the meta anytime soon. And chiming in at number 6 is Orcustrated Babel, a field spell for Orcus with a really unique effect. Unlike the other field spells of this list, Babel doesn't search a card, and it isn't a floodgate either. Instead, Babel has an effect which makes the effects of all Orcus monsters in the graveyard and all Orcus linked monsters in the field quick effects, allowing them to be used at spell speed 2 rather than spell speed 1. And its second effect allows you to add it from your graveyard to your hand, except during the turn that it was sent there, allowing for some pretty neat recursion. Now, why was Babel so good? With Babel up, Orcus gains access to a much stronger end board that allows him to use the Orcus effects on your opponent's turn. This either allows for extra follow-up or for crazy interaction. For example, on your turn, using the effect of Orcus Simple Skeleton can allow you resources, or can be used to clear up your opponent's board with the effect of Dingirsu. But on your opponent's turn, Simple Skeleton becomes a lot more potent, allowing you to summon Dingirsu from your graveyard at a key point in your opponent's combo to send any card they control to the graveyard and putting a stop to that combo. It also made Orcus's graveyard really hard to interact with. DD crowing a Harp Horror or an Orcus Nightmare can be a really effective way to put a stop to Orcus's turns, since both of their effects generate a lot of value for Orcus. But while Babel is up, both the effects of Harp Horror and Nightmare become quick effects, which means that if you target the card in the graveyard with your DD Crow, your opponent can just chain their Harp Horror or Nightmare in response, ensuring that DD Crow does less than nothing to stop their combos. Another part of what made Babel so valuable was that it was so easy to access. So much so that successful Orcus lists both in modern format and in TOS only ever played one copy. Part of why is because the card is recursive, and if it was sent to the graveyard, could use its second effect to bring itself back to the field. But the main reason why was because Orcus simply didn't need to run more than one copy, as they were virtually guaranteed to find it with the effect of Galatea, which lets you shuffle a banished machine monster into your deck to set any Orcus spell trap card directly from your deck. Orcus has its fair share of cards which it can set off of Galatea. Usually Galatea is grabbing Orcus Crescendo, a counter trap capable of negating and banishing an opponent's card, and it's one of the strongest forms of negation available in the game. But you could also grab Babel if Crescendo was already in rotation, allowing you to use your Orcus monsters as quick effects, interrupting your opponent with Girsu, or drowning an advantage by being able to use your Orcus graveyard effects both on your turn and your opponent's. Babel technically isn't weaker now than it was back in 2019. In fact, it's just as strong and is part of why Orcus is still a playable deck in the modern game. It's the cards around Babel, however, which made Orcus as an engine much less worth it. Losing Mermaid meant that any two bodies could no longer do the full Orcus combos, and meant that the Orcus package in decks became a lot heavier. And losing Harp Horror meant the deck lost a ton of consistency, making it so the Orcus engine, despite still having its powerful rewards in Babel and Crescendo, was no longer worth the risk. But even despite the amount of damage the ban list has done to Orcus, it's still a viable deck, and one that still causes debate whenever Harp Horror returning is brought up. And Babel is a huge part of what makes it so playable, while also being a really interesting effect. Alright, and that's it for part 1 of the top 10 best field spells. The full video was a little bit too long, so we split it into 2 parts. The next part should be coming out shortly, or should be already available if you're watching this a little bit more in the future.